Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you, and thanks for coming to this session on structural change, small SMEs, and economic diversification. We have 3 papers. The first one is by Jala Youssef. Where is she? There she is. Okay. It's about structural change, policies, and structural change. You have about 17 minutes because we have 3 papers. We're going to do the first one in half an hour and go to the second one, half an hour per paper. So please, go ahead.
Thank you so much.
So I give you back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mongi. Thank you so much. Maybe. Okay. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I wanted to thank the ERF team for the conference organization. Being an ex-ERF, I know how much time and effort this conference takes, so thank you for everything. I wanted also to thank Professor Mongi for his comments in advance that I'm sure will help me improve the paper. And thank you, of course, for choosing our session. So I'm presenting today my paper entitled Which Policies Induce Structural Change in MENA Countries, Evidence from Macro and Micro Data. So to motivate this work, I'm starting with some bad news that many developing countries suffer from having a large surplus of labor in the low productive sectors. So the engine that would help moving resources from the least productive sectors to the most productive sectors is known as structural change. When I say structural change, I know that the very first thing that would come to your mind is going to be the Roderick story that would help us understand the extent of structural change on the country level. However, the availability of data sets on the firm level would allow us to have a closer understanding on how this process eventually takes place. Back to the title of my paper, Structural Change and Policies. What's the link? So productivity losses from misallocation can result from distortions that can be acted upon using policies. So definitely, government policies may not necessarily affect directly productivity, but they definitely affect producers' movement into a higher position in their industry productivity distribution. In this paper, I'm trying to give an emphasis on an interesting and under-researched region, which is the Middle East. The research on the region has already identified the lack of structural change. The difficult question, which policies do we need to look at? There is still no consensus on which policies can leverage the process of structural change in developing countries. So do we only need macro policies, or we also need structural policies, or we eventually need a reasonable mix of both? So structural policies, they are known for improving the allocative efficiency. As per macro policies, the argument that I'm trying to advance here is that macro policies can eventually go beyond the simple objective of macroeconomic stability, and they can be eventually concerned with development objectives, including structural change, in case they are designed in a way to be development friendly. And by this, I mean in case they are designed in a way to be counter-cyclical. I'll explain later in details what do I mean precisely by counter-cyclical. Speaking of the data of this paper, I calculate the structural change on the sector level using firm level data, and I have the policies on the country level. So that's why sectors, it's as if they are nested within the countries, because they face the same macro context and the same policies that are applied in a horizontal way. So this is why I'm going to employ in this paper the multi-level mixed effects model, and I'll explain definitely later in details what do I mean by this. So the main objective of this paper is to study the policies that would leverage the process of structural change in developing countries. My contribution is that I rely on the World Bank enterprise surveys in order to compute structural change on the sector level. I try to investigate the role of both structural versus macro policies in leveraging the process of structural change. I try also to introduce some heterogeneity in the policies measurements. So instead of measuring them on the country level, I try to come up with some measurements on the sector level, and I rely on the multi-level model in order to merge the sector level data with the macro data. don't know what happened. I guess that oops, there is something wrong with my slides. I'm really sorry for this. Sorry, who's from the ERF? I can download them again if you would like.
هو أنهي واحد أصلا؟
مش دول، أنا مش عارفة انتوا حاطينهم فين هنا مثلا.
هما مش هي كانت في الفلاشة؟
لا.
لا.
بس wait, I can download them again.
ما فيش تقريبا انترنت بس أنا ممكن فاهمك.
ما فيش انترنت. Okay. I think there is. I'm really sorry for the technical issue.
I think ما فيش انترنت.
Okay. Check. There is a problem with this line.
أصل هي already على ال
See, they are not downloaded correctly. There is missing.
لا ما هو هنا مفيش انترنت.
So نعمل hotspot.
نو ادوني تاب ثانية. انتي البرزنتيشن نفسها اللي بعتيها لي فيها مشكلة؟
لا.
ولا الفيو بتاعها؟
Here it is.
Okay, so المشكلة فين؟
Okay. كده expression. Maybe the full view is problematic. Let's keep this one here.
Alright, so how about
مش لازم بقى full view. خلينا زي ما
let's
احنا
ممكن
وخلاص.
تكون بس هقولك حاجة ممكن تكون فصلت.
Okay.
Which one is it? Okay. Can you give it? Go ahead.
كده
انت
لا
بتفرش
بس,
slide.
بس كده ممكن اقلل الزوم معلش كده مش هعرف امشيها خليها السايز العادي لانه كده
No worries, whatever is more comfortable for you. كده؟
no. هي فين معلش ممكن نفتحها تاني we keep it to the actual size. Yes.
This is easier
Yes.
for you?
Oh,
Okay,
yeah,
go
yeah.
ahead.
Sorry for the interruption. So this is the outline of my presentation. First of all, for the literature, I don't want to be spending too much time on this, so I'll skip it quickly. The paper is related to two main strands of the literature on resource allocation and the literature on the policy drivers of resource allocation, that it is divided to two main strands as well, the structural policies and the macro stabilization policies, the impact of these policies on the resource allocation. For the econometric specification, I'm going to explain it in two steps. So first of all, how do I compute the structural change? And the second step is how do I study the impact of the different policies on the sectoral structural change? So the first step is that I'm going to use the World Bank Enterprise Surveys, the comprehensive database, in order to compute structural change on the sector level in a large group of developing countries, including Middle East countries. So what I'm going to show you throughout this presentation, most of the results are based on the large sample of all developing countries. However, the results of the Middle East countries were very consistent with the results of the large group of all developing countries. So that's why I thought the results with the large group are going to be like more interesting. So I'm going to compute a productivity decomposition using equation 1. So just to give you the rationale behind this equation, this is the sector productivity that I decompose into two main components. So the first component is going to be an unweighted average of the sector productivity, and this is going to represent the within component, and the second component is going to be the structural change or the resource allocation, and it's known also in this literature as the covariance term because it's as if it's a covariance between the firm's productivity and their size. For the second step is that I'm going to study the impact of the different policies on sectoral structural change. I start with a very basic baseline using equation 2. So my dependent variable is going to be the sectoral structural change that results from the productivity that I have shown in the previous slide. For the explanatory variables, I have classic controls following the existing literature, so training, formality, ownership, size, age, certification, and then I studied the impact of the different policies, so the structural policies versus the macro policies. For the structural policies, I look at competition, trade, finance, and macroeconomic institutions, which are fiscal rules and central bank transparency, for example. So these I consider as a structural policy rather than a macro stabilization story. For the macro stabilization, I look at them into two different ways, the macro outcomes and the macro tools. So for the macro outcomes, I look at classic outcomes, so inflation, exchange rate misalignment. The REER, I construct a business cycle indicator for the bad times. It's a dummy that would take one in bad times. And also I construct measurements for the fiscal and monetary policy cyclicality. So it's going to be the correlation between the cyclical component of the real GDP and the cyclical component of the real government expenditure. And I have a similar measure for monetary policy cyclicality. I also have measurements for the macroeconomic tools, for the fiscal and monetary tools actually. So I have the tax rate and the policy rate. All this was more or less the baseline, but now I want to explain why do I have to use the multi-level model, multi-level mixed effects model. As I previously said in the beginning, the sectors in the same country, they are not independent because they face the same macro context and the same policies that affect their performance. So that's why the multi-level mixed effects model, it suits the structure of the data. It helps accounting for this clustering effect. It helps obtaining correct and efficient estimates, and it addresses the potential endogeneity challenges. Another info on this model, multi-level mixed effects model, the name comes from the fact that this model allows for including random and fixed effects at the same time. So I'm going to estimate equation 5, and I can include country, year, and sector fixed effects, and I cluster standard errors at the country level. I have also an extension that I try to introduce some heterogeneity in the policies measurements. So instead of measuring them on the country level, I try to measure them on the sector level. So for the structural policies, that was the very easy part, because in the enterprise surveys, we have the de facto performance on the sectoral level. If we take the average of the firm performance, we can have the de facto performance on the sector level. So for competition, trade, and finance, we have measurements in the enterprise surveys. For the macro policies, that was the difficult part, and that was very data extensive. I would have loved to go through the details, but just to give you a very quick overview on what I did, I tried to calculate a real exchange rate by sector. So instead of measuring the real exchange rate using the overall trade flows, I used the sectoral trade flows. For the business cycle, I try to create an index that would give an idea on the exogenous demand variation. So it's an output-weighted average of the percentage change in activity of all other sectors that purchase from a particular sector. And I use the EORA database in order to calculate this measurement. And for the fiscal and monetary policy cyclicality, instead of using the overall real GDP, I use the sector GDP. For the stylized facts, just to give you very quickly a flavor of the data, I have here on average the structural change share in the productivity decomposition on average for all MENA countries, all years. Some very, very quick thoughts. I'm sorry, the graphs look not very clear, but just to give you a flavor of what's happening. The structural change patterns across the different sectors are very heterogeneous. The contribution of structural change is very modest relative to the within component. Another also interesting finding is that when we look at the sectors that are heavily regulated, like the transport, the electricity, and so on, we can see that the structural change is becoming even negative, not minimal, but also negative. For the empirical findings, let me remind you that my Y is the covariance term that results from the productivity decomposition. The higher it is, the more the employment is allocated to the productive firms. And the more the process of resource allocation is efficient. I'm not going to report the controls because they were basically significant, exerting the expected signs and everything. So I'm going to focus in my results, in the results that I'm going to show you now, on the policies themselves. Just to give you a very quick idea on the linkage between each and every policy and the structural change. So to start with, for the competition policy, I have a measurement for the markup on the overall level of the economy, which is the inverse of the labor income share. And it exerts a negative and significant effect on sectoral structural change. And basically the idea here is that competition is very important for structural change because it helps moving the market shares to the most productive firms. For the trade, the WTO membership exerts a positive and significant relationship on the sectoral structural change. This is actually very consistent with the literature because trade is a very important determinant for structural change on the empirical and the theoretical level. The idea here is that the deeper integration in trade is going to increase the pace and extent of industrialization, and it will raise productivity within and across the sectors. For the finance, the financial development measure is going to improve structural change. This is also a finding that is consistent with the literature because the low financial development can lead to misallocation of credit, and actually the credit is a very important determinant for structural change. In a way, it's going to determine the extent of structural change that is going to happen on the sector level. For the macro institutions, so the central bank transparency and the fiscal rules, they are also useful for structural change. I see them doing a sort of a dual role. They ensure the macro stability, of course, and at the same time, they can even improve the implementation of the structural policies. For the business cycle, it exerts actually a positive and significant effect on structural change. Let me remind you, this is an indicator for the bad times. It may sound like a finding that doesn't make sense, but this is very consistent with the literature because the recessions induce the exit of the least productive firms, and this is a sort of a silver lining of the bad times. For the rear, the cyclical component of the rear, it reduces structural change. This is consistent also with the literature because it gives an idea on the adjustment costs in employment relative to the movements in the real exchange rate. For the macro tools, the policy rate, it reduces structural change. I think that this is also a finding that makes sense because high policy rates are very evident in developing countries, and because developing countries would use it to curb inflation. But while curbing inflation, this makes the cost of capital very high for the firms. And as I previously said, the availability of credit is very important for the structural change process. The corporate tax rate increases structural change. This was a bit of a finding that is difficult to interpret, but we can say that the fiscal policy is going to correct for market failures, and the taxes are going to be used to penalize in a way the anti-competitive behavior. For the cyclicality, just to give you an idea of what do I mean by cyclicality. Ideally, you may want to have your policies moving in an opposite direction relative to the cycle of the economy. How? For example, if we are in a good time, you may want to have your you may want, for example, on the fiscal policy front, to reduce your expenditures in order to save for the upcoming bad times. And similarly for the monetary policy, in the good times, you may want to increase your cost of capital. So the fiscal policy pro-cyclicality index reduces structural change, and the monetary policy counter-cyclicality measure increases structural change. So what's the link, again, between counter-cyclicality and structural change? The counter-cyclicality is going to make developing country less vulnerable to the exogenous shock. It's going to reduce the aggregate volatility, and thereby firms would be able to preserve their innovative and their productive activities. This is why counter-cyclical policies matter for structural change. For the extension, okay, I will conclude. For the extension, I have the policies measures on the sector level. So instead of using the policies on the country level, I try to measure them on the sector level to introduce some heterogeneity. So for the structural, I looked at some de facto measures from the enterprise surveys. And for the macro policies, I tried to create some indicators by sector, and they basically confirm their previous findings. So to conclude, the structural change process has not been universal, unfortunately, and the desirable patterns of structural change remain hindered in several developing countries. My productivity decomposition exercise shows that there is a great extent of heterogeneity in the patterns of structural change among the different sectors, and the contribution of structural change to productivity is very modest. For the policies, competition, trade and finance and macro institutions, along with the business cycle downturns, improve structural change. The policy rate and the cyclical rear appreciation reduce it. So my findings highlight in a way also the importance of the counter-cyclical policies. From a policy perspective, some policy thoughts. MENA region is unfortunately very prone to several exogenous shocks. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the COVID pandemic. I think that policymakers would need to ensure that the structural change process and the long-run growth are not being sacrificed while facing these very difficult crises. The findings confirm the importance of structural policies that are not these policies are not very famous for policymakers. They are very difficult to implement. I think also that macroeconomic stability is key and it shouldn't be compromised, but at the same time, focusing only on stability might be a bit insufficient. And I think that we can go beyond a little bit the concept of stability and to account for some counter-cyclical policies. And on this note, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is really a good paper. This is been a big effort, a lot of work in terms of not just data and calculation and modeling and econometrics, but also in terms of thoughts about development, because structural change is a basic, it's a main thing for development. It's about how to go in order to move from low productivity economies to a higher productivity economies, from economies where we have low productivity, low salary, low wages, to an economy where that is more performing, better performing, with stepping up to new and higher technology and so on, and diversified also. And it's also about economies which are dominated by one sector. I mean, basically, for our region, oil exporting countries. Going from there to diversified, more sustainable, more productive, less dependent. This is what it is all about. So it's a very important work, and I think it's done very carefully. However, I have some questions, and maybe which could be also, which may require some more effort. with respect to the data, I noticed that it's not obvious why you selected those countries. The rationale for the choice of the countries is not obvious at all. And there aren't enough countries where structural change has been effective and significant. Most of the countries are countries which have been stagnant and have not succeeded sufficiently. Our countries have not been doing the best in terms of structural change, and the other countries you have added are more or less the same. You have not put in countries like East Asia and so on, which have been much more successful. The other thing about data, structural change is a long-term process, and your data does not include a long enough time series to allow for capturing structural change. So perhaps it's difficult to find that kind of data, but this is something that is missing. If you can do something about it, it will make the work much more variable. You have not talked about industrial policies. This is about industrial policies. I've not heard you use the word at all. And because when you think about structural change, somehow it's about identifying sectors or activities that are likely to be more productive and to induce positive structural change. Your presentation remains very general. And I think it's important to identify policies that are most effective to generate or to incentivize, to create the incentives for developing new activities, and which ones are the most appropriate for our region. I think it would be nice if you can do something about that. Okay, the last question or comment I have is about splitting the work in two parts. One is about stabilization and macro policies, and the other one is about, you don't have one single integrated framework. And that bothers me personally. If we want to think, the word is the same. You're dealing by the same word. So you need a same unintegrated framework which can be dealt with in terms of macro policy, whenever it's necessary, and in terms of regional, sectoral, or whatever. Nevertheless, I think you have done well by distinguishing between policies that are really targeting structural change from policies that deal with stabilization, and that's very important. These are a few questions, and let me ask the audience. I'm sure they have other questions, and this is interesting. It opens the debate.
Yeah, it's a great work. She put really effort. I think, integrating all this micro data and getting a panel setting is not easy, I can imagine. So thank you very much for your presentation. And the second thing, maybe I missed there. How did you can you explain how did you measure this business cycle? Yeah, can you please stand? Because I think it seemed to me a bit not broad enough to capture the business cycles, because business cycles for all the countries, I think, is... No, yeah, because I missed, I think so. Can I see the definition again? Or maybe during the break? I think it's not working. This.
No, it's fully.
Sorry.
Thanks. Well, I mean, besides the issue,
Please, get ready, get ready. So let's save the time and not do the same mistake.
بحكي ولا لا؟ Yeah, besides,
Pay for the time. They are subsidizing.
we'll talk in the hall later.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. أكيد. Yeah, I mean, besides the issue of the time frame, it would really be good if we had the papers before, because the presentation is so quick. I mean, it seems really interesting as an approach, this multi-level. Can you say a few words on how you measure structural change? I saw productivity. Is it just productivity? Or can you pull out of the microdata the size of the sector, or is just the productivity of the sector?
Sure.
Of course, we have to be. We don't have much time. We have all.
I'll be very, very quick. So on the issue of the short time period, I have the constraint of the data because the enterprise surveys, they are only available since 2006. And I just, you are reading my thoughts because I have another paper where co-authored with Mohamed Ali and Shahir Zaki, where we look at the long run story because we look at the sectoral data on the country level. So it allows us for having a long time frame. So this is a complementary work to the other paper, but we have the data constraint of the availability of enterprise surveys. So that's on the long-term issue. On the industrial policies, Professor Mongi, I totally agree with you, and I had this discussion previously with Mohamed Ali. The problem is they are very difficult to measure in a large group of developing countries. So in another paper, I have looked at, for example, the development banks. So we have a database on the availability of data of development banks by objective. So this, in a way, could be a proxy that I could also use in this paper. For the, just to respond to the comments on how do I measure the business cycle and how do I measure the structural change?
Structural change, that's the point.
Sure. Dr. Ishaq, so it's using equation 1. So it's the sector productivity that I split to two components. An unweighted average, that's the within component, and the structural change is going to be this term. It's a covariance.
Consider the sector like manufacturing and the services, right? Two different.
And it's way more disaggregated than this.
So
It's on the
your graph was not so.
it's on the two
clear.
digits. It's on the two digits.
Manufacturing, but your time then mentioned included the COVID.
You finish because you're done?
Oh, it was on one.
And also for
No,
the,
I'm just wondering because
it stops at 2021, the date.
2021.
Yes.
So what I'm thinking, because during COVID, if we see the manufacturing sector, like for instance retail selling or like the supermarkets, they did great profit. I mean, it was really high because everybody was demanding own food. But many of the other sectors in manufacturing, the businesses in manufacturing, they are closed during this. They had a huge productivity loss. This I didn't understand how you really consider the business cycle, because some businesses were going down and some businesses were going up during the COVID.
We have, just to quickly respond, but maybe we can discuss in details later. I have sector and years fixed effects and country fixed effects, so I think this could account a bit for your story. And for the business cycle indicator, it's going to be a dummy that takes 1 when the output gap as a percentage of the potential output is lower than -1%. So it's a definition in the literature. If you have other definitions, I would love to try. Thank you.
Too much, just I was curious.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the comments.
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead. The second paper is about structural change in exporting country. I mean, we're oil and hydrocarbon main industry. How to diversify, and which policies are likely to induce diversification, and what extent the macro policies, I mean, monetary and fiscal policy can do it. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this session, and special thanks to ERF Scientific Committee for accepting our paper entitled Oil Exporting Countries and Economic Diversification, the Role of Monetary and Fiscal Policies. This paper is co-authored with Xiaofei from School of Management, Tovonony Razafindrabe from the University of Rennes, and myself, Mohamed Tahar Benkhodja from School of Management. As you know, or as you may know, oil exporting countries often face external shocks such as oil price volatility or imported good price fluctuations. And as their economies are not really diversified, the consequences can be significant in the short term, but also in the long term. In the short term, for example, since 2014, the downward trend in oil prices intensified by COVID-19 pandemic has caused a significant drop in Algerian foreign exchange reserves that reached 44 billion at the end of 2021, while they exceeded the 180 billion in 2014. Similarly, the sovereign wealth fund, known in Algeria as the Regulation Revenue Fund, was completely drained in 2018. But also more recently, the war in Ukraine has caused an increase in the global bill of imported goods price, and the consequences was, and this contributed to current account imbalances. In the long term, oil exporting countries or economies may suffer from the global decline in oil demand, and this can be caused by, for example, in developed countries are now shifting toward a more ecological production, so their oil demand will decline in the future, but also, and this point is more hypothetical, some rich resource country is at the peak oil production, and the oil revenues are relatively short. Horizon is relatively short. So, to avoid negative consequences of such situation, oil exporting countries should diversify their economy by improving their non-oil production capacity, for example, or reducing their dependence on imported products. In 2016, the International Monetary Fund has made some recommendations to facilitate the transition from an oil-dependent economy to a more diversified one. And the recommendations, some point here, are macroeconomic stability, insulate the economy from the volatility of oil price, and sound fiscal policy, effective liquidity management, and prudent monetary policy to facilitate this transition. And following these recommendations, we wanted to evaluate the role of monetary and fiscal policies to ensure this stability and insulate the economy from oil price volatility. And to do this, we built a macroeconomic model called Dynamic and Stochastic General Equilibrium Model, or rank model, representative Asian New Keynesian model, with including several agents like households, oil firm, non-oil firm, a private bank with a public sector, including central bank and government. And we simulated two scenarios. The first scenario is the negative oil price shock, and the second scenario is a positive imported good price shock. And under each scenario, we evaluated the effectiveness of three main instruments: conventional monetary policy, unconventional monetary policy, and fiscal policy. And I put a part of this model in appendix, and if you want, I can explain you the model later, because it would be very difficult to explain it in 5 minutes. So the model is available, and I can of course explain you this model if you want later. But our main results are when we simulate during the first episode, or during the first scenario, under the negative oil price shock. And if you prefer, I can explain you a part of this model before. No?
It's up to you.
Okay.
You still have
It will have time.
You still have about 8 minutes.
Only 8 minutes. Okay. So under the negative oil price shock, we can see that, first of all, here the black solid curve, the red solid dashed curve, the blue dashed curve, and the yellow dashed curve represent respectively the response of the model under negative oil price shock. The blue dashed curve, the response of the model under a negative oil price shock combined with fiscal policy. I mean a fiscal subvention to the non-oil sector. The red dashed curve here represents the response of the model under negative oil price shock combined with a conventional monetary policy, followed by, after a negative oil price shock, the central bank reduced its nominal interest rate by 1%. And here, the yellow dashed curve here represents the unconventional monetary policy, and we modeled the unconventional monetary policy just as a shock. We took the form of autoregressive form, but of course we will maybe introduce another rule a la Gettler and Karady, which is a Taylor-tip rule, and I can explain you this rule later also. But here it's just a shock on a dynamic of non-capital in the non-oil sector. And the response here, as we can see, in the aftermath of a negative oil price shock, the oil production falls, and then consequently the oil revenue fall as well. And as a result, the deposit to the private bank decline, and consequently there is less credit and liquidity in the economy. And then all interest rates rises, but also as the cost of capital here rise or becomes more expensive, the consumer price index rise as well. This is the first, this is the response of the model just under negative oil price shock. And then when we combine different instruments, we can see that the response of the model, or we can simply conclude that the fiscal policy or the fiscal subvention and is the best instrument to cope with the negative consequences of a negative oil price shock. And the fiscal subvention or the fiscal subsidy in the model is captured by the fact that the government injects a part of its revenue directly to the non-oil sector to support this sector and to improve the investment in this sector. Also another remark is that the response of the model is correct and under the unconventional monetary policy, but the conventional monetary policy here is not really sufficient. As we can see, the response of the model, the red dashed curve and the black solid curve are almost the same. The second scenario is a positive imported good price, and under this positive imported good price, we have approximately the same responses. I mean, the fiscal policy is also here the best instrument, but we can, of course, later combine this instrument with the unconventional monetary policy to see if the policy mix can be used or not, and that depends on the responses of the model. But here also, after the negative oil, a positive, imported good price, the response of the model is, or the instrument fiscal subsidy is the best one. Finally, we simulated the impact of these two main scenarios on the welfare. And the welfare effect of these two shocks is the results are almost the same as for the previous scenarios and the impulse response functions. And under demand shock, here is the negative oil price shock, and supply shock, positive imported good price shock. There is the welfare effect is negative, but when we introduce fiscal subsidy, conventional monetary policy, and unconventional monetary policy, we can see that the fiscal policy can reduce this negative effect better than the conventional and unconventional monetary policy. And to conclude, we can say that a conventional monetary policy loses its efficiency facing oil price shocks in the presence of a private bank, and maybe this means that oil exports on private bank liquidity and credit is much greater than central bank adjustments on its standard interest rate. Negative oil price shock, fiscal subsidy, and unconventional monetary policy under negative oil price shock, of course, seems to be the best policies. And due to political frictions, supply chain crisis may bring a profound impact on oil exporting economies, and under a negative supply shock, neither monetary nor fiscal policies could have a significant effect on the economy, but fiscal policy can reduce this negative effect more than unconventional and conventional monetary policies. And finally, developing the non-sector, the non-oil sector should be the priority in the coming year or decades, and this can be reached using especially fiscal subsidy and unconventional monetary policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Of course, again, this is a very relevant, very relevant work, especially in the context of Algeria and other oil exporting countries that who have the ambition to diversify their economies and be less dependent on oil. So the topic is certainly very interesting. I mean, also the efforts in terms of economic analysis and model building is interesting. I would like to ask, go ahead.
If I have time, I can.
No, I will ask you
Yes.
if you can not to present the model as it is, because after all, people know what computable general equilibrium model is all about. I mean, the logic of a computable general equilibrium model, dynamic or not dynamic, is quite well. I mean, but perhaps I would like to ask you to explain a little better what are the sectors that are included in your model, because this is crucial if we are talking about diversification. And it seems, from what I read in your paper, you are using basically two sectors, an oil sector and a non-oil sector. This is, if you just do that, that's not enough to talk about diversification. You need to split the non-oil in enough activities or subsectors or whatever you call it to allow for diversification. Otherwise, it's lumping a lot of activities and it's very hard. So if you can explain that a little better, how households behave, what do they consume, what the economy really produces, how producers are behave. I mean, to what extent they depend on government incentives. I mean, you're talking about subsidies. Are subsidies determinant for their decision making? I mean, we would like to understand the dynamics of their behavior a little better, because my main question, or maybe my main comment, is about the policies you are focusing on. I mean, if you're talking about diversification, monetary policy and the standard fiscal policies are usually appropriate for stabilization, for short-term objectives, for counter-cyclical policies, or for managing the cycles, and not so much for diversifying and developing new sectors or new. That has to do with developing human capital, with creating the appropriate climate, fiscal policies in the sense of structure, more detailed subsidies or taxes and so on. But if you just stick to monetary and ordinary standard fiscal policies, that we know that you cannot generate sufficient diversification. But that's a result by itself. If the IMF has recommended these policies, you are telling them, with this we cannot do much. We need more. We need some sort of industrial policies. We need to develop other things. We have to do with work on technology, on education, on infrastructure. These are the things, regional development and so on. Identify the potential in Algeria for new activities, and Algeria has a lot of potential, and so on. So if your purpose is to prove that conventional monetary and fiscal policy are not sufficient, you did your job. But if you aim to do more, then I think something is missing. So, please, if you have,
We just wanted to shed some light on the role of fiscal and monetary policies.
go ahead.
We just wanted to verify if fiscal and monetary policies can stabilize the economy or can help to stabilize the economy and to insulate the economy from the oil price volatilities to facilitate the transition. We didn't study or studied oil policy, fiscal and monetary policy as diversification policies. Of course, we have to take into account structural reforms and industrial policies, etc. Right, that's true. But here, just we wanted to verify if these policies can help to stabilize the economy and to insulate by introducing a banking system in the model, because in terms of modeling, this is the major contribution of our paper. We introduced the banking system to capture the liquidity generated by oil revenues. And this liquidity can be a source of some issues in oil exporting Arab countries or oil exporting countries.
And how does this differ from having, say, a stabilization fund, as opposed to letting the revenues all go to the banking sector and then having countering that with fiscal policy? Right? Can't you just have a stabilization fund and not have deposits in the banking sector fluctuating the cycle?
Yes, that can help, of course. That could be a good, a solution to.
Effective than shocking the economy and then countering that with fiscal policy.
But how to do that in an economy if we create, for example, in Algeria, they created a sovereign wealth fund to save the oil revenues, but these oil revenues came from taxes. But here is the deposit of oil firm. And deposit of oil firm, it's very difficult to say to the firm, to the firm to deposit it somewhere else. I don't know where. A fund, for example, created just to keep this liquidity in this fund, but I think that I don't know if I correctly understand your question, but the response is we
invested abroad, not in the domestic.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Yes, but knowing that this is the liquidity generated by oil revenue is deposited in the bank's account of oil firm, so we tried to verify what could be the more effective instruments. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. To the chair, not everybody in this room understands. I will say that as a disclaimer, we don't all these countries. And maybe that informs my question. I don't understand the last point in your... Sorry, I said it. I don't understand the last point in your conclusion. And maybe that's just a phrasing. I don't think you can conclude from the paper that this economy is, that it should be a priority. I mean, isn't that this? I don't understand that last point. Yeah, how does that follow? You call it a conclusion. Maybe it's just a formulation issue, but you call it a conclusion. But I don't see how that's concluded from the paper.
Yeah, the paper. This point, this last point.
Yeah.
Yeah, here we wanted to say that just oil-dependent countries have to should diversify their economy by developing the non-oil sector.
But it's a starting point, not a conclusion.
Yes.
Right.
I think it's important to say that. And then then the follow-up question to that is if you if you stabilize the income sufficiently, wouldn't you be doing the opposite? How does a stabilization, an insulation against the shocks, would ever help diversify? It would simply make the oil sector more attractive to the rest of the economy. I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I don't see how that stabilization actually leads to a diversification.
But can help to diversify the economy, because if we don't insulate the economy from these variations, if you don't stabilize enough non-oil sector, how can we develop this sector? And to diversify this non exporting countries, of course we have to develop this sector. And to develop this sector, we have to stabilize it. And to stabilize it, we can use this fiscal policy or an unconventional monetary policy. That's why we use these two instruments here. This is the point.
But that by itself does nothing for diversification.
Yes, this is a condition, among others.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm confused. I was confused that you see this as a conclusion. That's the objective,
Okay.
if you like.
My understanding that the initial idea came from the IMF, and IMF business is not about development; it's about stabilization in the best case. So what they told them to do, what they are supposed, they usually do. I mean, it's pay attention to monetary policies for and stabilize the economy as a precondition for growth and development and so on. This is how I understand it, and to make sense of all of this story is that that's not enough. It may be useful, but not enough. Okay, last but certainly not least, we have the third paper about the impact of COVID on the economy. This time it's about the Tunisian economy, and the focus is on SMEs because we cannot, the paper cannot deal with everything. That chose to focus on SMEs, how they reacted, and to the extent to which the policies adopted by the Tunisian government has helped or has not helped enough. Okay, so the floor is yours. As the last half hour, because we started a little bit late, we have another half hour to go. So you speak for about 17 minutes and allow for more questions. Oh, you need that. Okay. You don't have to pay for it. You can it? Okay.
Okay. So, good morning, everybody, and I'm very honored to be here to present to you our recent paper about the great lockdown and the small business impact channels and the adaptation to the COVID-19. And this paper is co-authored with Lisa Chauvet and Mohamed Marouani. So, in this paper, we are interested in two questions. One, what are the effects of the demand shock and the supply shock on output and employment of small and medium firms in Tunisia? And second, why some firms are more resilient than the others? So that's our two main questions, and I will talk about the data later. So the literature divides the shocks induced by the COVID and the lockdown into two categories. The first order shocks include the labor supply shock. It is the reductions in labor due to the mandatory closures, and the direct demand shock, which is the change in consumer preference in terms of compositions and in terms of time. And the second order shocks include the intermediate input shock due to the closure of intermediate input suppliers. and the indirect demand shock, which caused by the income losses. So in this paper, we focus on just three shocks: the labor supply shock, the direct demand shock, and the intermediate input shock. So because it is the first years of the COVID, so we focus on just the three shocks. And the general findings of the literature, mostly at the macro level and about the US, is that the direct supply shock or the labor supply shock was larger than the direct demand shock during the lockdown in the US. And second, indirect demand shock might be larger than the initial supply shock. So there are several sources of resilience and vulnerabilities of firms during the shock. The classical factors are credit supply, trade credits, and firm heterogeneity. However, with the COVID-19, we have another factors of resilience. It's the technological flexibilities, more precisely the telework abilities of firms. So we exploit the variations across sectors of the shocks to run our two-way defensive regressions. You can see the moderates here. So in the left-hand side, the outcome is sales or employment of firm I in industry J, location R, and in year T. And on the right-hand side, we have three interactions of the different shock: the sectoral lockdown shock, the demand shock, and the intermediate input shock interact with the dummy variable indicating the post-treatment period. Because the treatment are at industry level, so we control for the industry fixed effects together with locations and year fixed effects. We also add time-varying firms covariates. So what is the most challenging in our paper is how to measure our three shocks. The first shock is the lockdown shock. It's a dummy which takes on the value 1 if firms operate in non-essential industry, which means that firms in the non-essential industry was forced to shut down during the first lockdown in the 2020, which was very strict in Tunisia, and I think that's why we call it the great lockdown everywhere in the world. So basically, all firms that operate in the non-essential industry was forced to close, so they are exposed to the lockdown shock, and zero otherwise. The demand shock. So we compute the demand shock as the industrial mean of the US firm change in annual forecast revenue before and after the COVID for the US firms. So the demand shock is the most difficult to measure because the availability of data. So we can't find any data from for other countries, but just the US. And so why we use the forecast revenue instead of the real revenue change? And this is because actually the forecast revenue include less the adaptations of firms. So it's the adaptations of firms. It's much more country specific than for us. It's much more country specific, which is quite different, of course, from the US and Tunisian firms. So that's why we include only the forecast revenue change. And the second question, is that there's large difference, between the consumer preference of the US and the Tunisians, and also the technological problems. So we also I also calculate the change in stock price of Tunisian firm, which has about like 60 firms, and to compare the two data sets, and we find very high correlations of around 0.3 up to 0.6 correlations between the two data. So the last shock is intermediate input shock, which is measured as the industrial share of firm having intermediate input constraint reported from the World Bank's Enterprise Follow-up Survey. So the demand shock and intermediate input shock are standardized and negatively correlated to the sales and employment. So about the data, we have the national firm census, and the time span is from 2015 and 2020. And this data provide basic information and firms' characteristic and performance, and we restrict the data for the small and medium firms data set. So, however, the census is not rich enough to examine the adaptations of firms, so we carry out surveys just after the first lockdown in Tunisia in 2020 to examine the SMEs adaptations. And the survey include firms and manager characteristic, firms' performance after the lockdown compared to 2019, and the strategy, adaptation strategy of firms. So just let me dive in the results. So you can see here that we plot the pattern trends of the three shock, the treatment group and the control groups over time. So you can see the start, it's 2015, and the end, the shock is the 2020s. And actually there's a small problem here that we observed for the lockdown shock, pre-trend problems starting from the 2018. Actually, this is the simple average of the sales, so we expect that this will improve out after we control for country for industry's fixed effects and just fixed effects. And we did the same time, same with employment average, and you can see that there's all parallel trends everywhere. Okay, so our main results here is that you can see that actually from the lockdown shock caused about 11% loss in sales for firm in 2020. And the demand shock, one standard deviations increase in the demand shock reduce about 9% of firm sales during 2020. So it's surprising because we expect that the lockdown should cause much more damage to the firms than any shock for the first years of the COVID. But it turns out that the demand shock costs much more, because you can see here the demand shock, this is one standard deviation can cost 9% of loss already. And the intermediate shock, one standard deviations increase in intermediate input shock costs about 5% of loss. However, when we pull the three shock together, we don't feel any significant effect of the intermediate input shock anymore. So it's just demand shock and the lockdown shock that have important impact on firms. So you can see here that's all fixed effect. So here in this event study plot, we plot, actually it's the same specifications as here, but instead of interactions between the shock and the post dummy, the post-treatment dummy, we use the years fixed year. We interact the shock with the years. So you can see that there is a small effect of the shock before the period, before the COVID. 2020. However, the directions is not it's not correct. So what we expect here is that actually our estimate might underestimate the effect of the shock, the demand shock, and the lockdown shock on the firms' sales. So what about employment? Remember that here we have only the formal employment of firms. The firm census look at only former firms, so we have employment for former firms. So former employment it's so we can see here is that only the lockdown shock have an effect, negative effect on formal employment, and it's caused a loss of 3% in employment for firms. So we actually, it's like we expect much more loss in informal sectors in terms of employment rather than formal sectors. So the event plots, so most of difference before the treatments are not significant, and you can see that here is there is the difference, largely different after the COVID. Okay, so this is quite a large table, but to document the heterogeneous effect of the shock on firm sales, so we interact a triple interactions of the shock and the covariates. You can see here we have different covariates at firms and industry level to look at to document which firms are more resilient than others. And what we can draw from this paper, this table, is there's no significant effects of the covariates for the lockdown shock. It means that the lockdown shock is so strict and it's so it's quite equal for every firms. So we don't observe any heterogeneous effect here. But for the demand shock, we see that special exporters and foreign firms are actually more resilient than the other two demand shock. In terms of sales, for employment, we see that the offshore firms, that means the totally exporter firms, are much more resilient than others. Now, we'll also examine our firm adaptations through our surveys implemented just 1 month after the lockdown in Tunisia. And we distinguish 3 different kinds of adaptations. The process adaptations, if there is any change in the productions, delivery or selling process of firms. The workplace adaptations, if some or other firms' employees were able to work from home. And finally, the financial adaptations, if a firm had trade credit during the crisis. So first, we look at the mitigations effect of workplace adaptations. And you can see here that we look at the difference in sales change of firms in just after the lockdown. And the baseline group that is omitted from the table is the firms in non-essential industry that have no adaptation. So this is the group that is the most vulnerable to firms. So we, as expected, we see that all other group, firms in essential industry and firms that had adaptation are much more resilient than firms that has no adaptations in non-essential industry. But what is interesting here is that you can see adaptations here, workplace adaptations, teleworkability are important for both essential and non-essential firms. We actually expected that it's only important. It was important for only non-essential, but it turns out that even essential firms that work in non-closed sectors also benefit from the teleworkability. And for process adaptations, however, we see that firms, even in non-essential sectors, if firms have adaptations in terms of process, it won't be very benefits. And finally, financial adaptations or trade credits have the mitigation effects for both non-essential and essential firms. And finally, conclusions. The impact of the shocks at the end of 2020, we can see that the direct lockdown effects it's about 11% loss of sales for firms in non-essential sectors. The demand shock contribute about 9% sales loss. per standard deviations, and the intermediate input shock have no effect when we include with other shocks. And finally, formal job loss resulting from the 2020 lockdown were mined for formal firms, of course. It's 3% of loss directly linked to the lockdown. And in terms of adaptations, we found that small firms were less exposed to the demand shock and supply shocks, and partial exporters and foreign firms were more resilient, and while firms that were actually able to make an adaptations were all better off. We see that the effect of adaptations are different. So for process adaptations was accentuated in essential sectors, while workplace adaptation and trade credit were more important for all firms in all sectors. So thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Sorry.
Once again, I don't need to say how interesting and important this work. It's all about not just COVID, but also about resilience and capacity of our firms and economy to adjust to shocks. And that's a very important question. As a matter of fact, my first comment is about this. I mean, you talked about resilience, and you classified firms by categories, those which are resilient and more or less resilient and the least resilient. I mean, it's very important to note what the cost in terms of loss of firms, of productive capacities. You have not talked about it enough. Are the least resilient firms threatened by this, by the possibility of leaving the economy? Are they going bankrupt? How many enterprises had to leave because to stop producing because they have lost so much? I mean, this is the most important impact of COVID. I mean, when it destroys productive capacity, if it's just a temporary impact, it's not that bad. I mean, of course, it's costly, but it's not that bad. The worst thing is when it destroys the economy. You have not talked enough about that. Maybe those least resilient are the ones that are leaving the economy. I'm not sure about that. Could you please, clarify a little bit this? Otherwise, I think the work is nicely done. I have doubts about some of the assumptions, in particular, the ones about measuring the demand shocks using the U.S. Measures. It's not convincing for me. There is such a gap between Tunisia and the U.S. economy. Perhaps it makes sense, but I'm not sure I got the point. The rationale for doing that, I understand that it's not for me. For a lot of things, we don't have the data, we don't have the information. We have to use something, proxies that are not good enough, but we think we can work with. But I think we need to convince us about some of those assumptions, especially about proxies. This time, of course, Mohamed Ali has something to say because he's one of the authors. I'll leave the...
If I can respond to the first and let her respond to the others, because it's very important.
No, I'll let you respond later. Let's see if there are other questions and comments. Raghi.
Thank you. This is a really interesting paper. Really makes very good use of data that's available. I have a couple of clarification questions and one maybe slightly deeper question. So on the demand shock, I just want to know, is this specified at the industry level or at what level exactly? How is the variation across firms in Tunisia of this particular variable? I didn't get that. And then you said you're using time-varying firm covariates as controls, right? But those could potentially be affected by the shocks, and therefore could be part of the outcome and could be attenuating your outcome when you control for those. I would have liked to see one without time-varying controls because they are potentially. The final one is the adaptation variable that you have. Now we know that firms adopt adaptation processes, techniques based on their performance. So why is that not completely endogenous? Can you explain why that can be used as an explanatory variable and not endogenous to the outcome itself?
Are there other comments, questions? Still have 5 minutes.
طب خلينا نشوفها طيب بس هنكمل كده. Thank you for the presentation. I'm just surprised that small firms were less exposed to shocks. So do you have an explanation why? Okay, I'm just surprised that small firms were less exposed to shocks. So is there a potential explanation why this? Thank you.
Mohamed Ali wants to say something.
No, just to reply to the first question.
Go ahead.
Because I think really it's a central question. Because in this analysis, probably this would have been the most interesting part to look at the survival. So we thought about it, but the problem is that in the census, we have firms every year, which are, many are the same and many are not. And we don't know if a firm disappears, if it's because it closed or because the guys didn't respond. So this is why, unfortunately, we couldn't do the survival analysis. And
True, because to identify which ones have disappeared because of COVID, it's an issue of it.
so just...
Yes, so for the questions about the assumptions of demand shock, so yes, as I explained in the paper, so we have, yes, of course, it's a quite a strong assumption, so that's why we have a check with the stock markets of the Tunisia. Actually, it's like Tunisian stock market, it has only about 60 firms in 20 different sectors that operated at that time. So we basically calculate the change in stock price of these firms before and after the outbreak of the COVID. And to compare these data sets of about 20 sectors with the 20 sectors the demand shock calculated from the US surveys, from the US firms. So what we find is positive correlations between around 0.3 up to 0.5. So it depends on the choice of the window of the stock price change. So that's reassures us much more about the assumptions. And for the questions about how I calculate the demand shock for the US firms, actually we have we use the data of US firms. So there's data from which provide the annual forecast revenue for each firms listed in the stock market of US. So we calculate that change and we take the means of the change for each industry, for each industries, US industry, and then we map this industry to the industrial level of Tunisia. So we have 3 digits level sectors. So for the second questions, I think...
time varying covariance.
Yes, so it's about time variance. So that's why actually we include the lack control of time variance. It's including So yeah, sure, that's we can provide. That's sure we can provide some estimations without the time varying control. That's for sure. Adaptations, it's we can say it's as an intermediate outcome. So yeah. Because it's quite fast, it's just arrived in 1 month. So what we argue here is that it's just depend really on the best capacities of firms that's on.
Look at it as an outcome, as a mechanism, to make it independent variable.
I think, yeah, sure, that we can look at it also. So thank you for the suggestions. Yeah, we can sure look at it as an outcome, like intermediate outcome. And for the last question, it's about why small firms were less exposed to the demand shock and supply shock. And actually, yeah, I think it's just the supply shock here. There's a type of the graph, but I will come back here. It's that the small firm is actually, yeah, it's less exposed to the intermediate input shock. One explanation possible here is that actually the medium firms, they are more sensible. It's because they maybe have more, they maybe use the more complicated, sophisticated intermediate input that requires maybe more suppliers. So for them, it's harder to find the replace during the lockdown.
And we have foreign suppliers,
yeah,
or more distant suppliers, while the small firms probably.
Maybe it's just local and.
Immediate inputs in the region.
Yeah.
Just a hypothesis.
Yes.
I don't know how we can check this.
But again, can we say that the least resilient firms are the ones who are likely to leave the economy and not
to exit.
To quit, I mean,
yeah.
to stop producing.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have.
We cannot.
Yeah.
We could not identify
yeah.
those who did not respond because of the COVID. That's for clear.
Yeah.
But among those who responded,
yes,
of course, some are suffering so much.
Yes.
That probably some of them could not stay in business anymore.
Yes.
Is there
Unfortunately, we don't have the second wave of data of survey, so we cannot know that if this firm exits after our survey, our first surveys. But yeah, maybe we need to look for other surveys. We had 2 or 3 waves of survey panels to see if adapt firms have. Yeah.
The business association claimed that a lot of firms have exited because
yes,
of
that's true.
And because of the difficulties that they have to go through. But we don't know exactly so how strictly true is that, because they claim things, but is it really due to because of COVID or something else? Are the numbers exact or not? We're not sure. Okay, I think we've been in a nice session. I hope you have enjoyed it. I'm sure it's interesting. Enjoy the rest of the. No, that's okay. Thank you very much.